Let's talk a little bit about JavaScript now, and so we can kind of help understand a little bit better. I have this graphic up here that defines the differences between client-side scripts and server-side scripts, okay? Now the first thing I want you to consider with this are some of these examples. We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, okay? And over here we have PHP, ASP, Python, JSP, Ruby, C, and Java, okay? So when we're thinking front end, okay, so almost think of CSS. Our CSS is not rendered out on the server and then sent to us, you know, in some picture of the website, right? Our website downloads the CSS and then renders out what the website will look like. Well, that kind of works the same way with JavaScript. JavaScript is downloaded and then rendered out on the client side or on your computer and then shown the user. Now that's a little different than some of, you know, like PHP and some of these other server languages where, you know, these are rendered out and, you know, like if you have a page that, you know, calculates something or generates out a Facebook page, for example, it will render that out and then return the HTML and not return, you know, it's not sending that and doing all the heavy lifting on the computer. And so there's some pros and cons to all of that. The big one is it's a lot faster to, you know, render everything on the user's computer because the user's computer is really fast. You don't have to do that on the back end or on the server. But the con is that you don't really have as much control because, you know, that can be looked at. You know, if you have a login you know, page and you're typing in a username and password, if it was rendered on the client side, then you could see, you know what is the username and password being typed in, and you know if that matches and things like that. So you have to do those kinds of things on the server. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a difference here. So we can see here client-side scripting is on the front end. It interfaces with the server. So the server sends the stuff over and then it's processed on the client side, and the server side, the processing happens on the server. We can see all the code to a client side, you know, just like we would pull up your CSS or HTML. We can also pull up your JavaScript to look to see what you're typing out. If you're to do that on a server side, you know, with PHP, you can't see the code that's actually being typed in, so it's protected. So a little bit different there. So that makes, you know, JavaScript and things like that are on the client side a little less secure, and the server side a little bit more secure. And then we have some examples here. Now, you've probably heard of JavaScript. Maybe you've heard of Java. You know, I've got this little graphic here that says Java is to JavaScript as ham is to hamster. Okay, now just because Java and JavaScript sound a lot alike, they actually have more differences than they have similarities. Okay, so they may just have the name Java in there, but they're totally different. So if we look back at the history of JavaScript, there's a lot to it. So first off, you know, it's important to understand that these are different. Back in the early 90s, we had Sun Microsystems who was developing Java. Now, Java is a programming language. It's, you know, very mature. It's used for all kinds of devices, maybe like your Blu-ray player and, you know, all kinds of stuff, you know, it's utilized in. But it was doing that, okay? And then there was a group of people over at Netscape at the time, and you can see here Netscape Navigator launches. And we have this Brendan Eich, I think that's how you say it, who put together JavaScript. Now, at the time, he was calling it LiveScript, but they started doing a bunch of work together, Netscape and Sun Microsystems, and so they decided to change it back to JavaScript. And so that's kind of where the name JavaScript has come about. But they're, again, very, very different. And you can see, now what we, you know, JavaScript was renamed to the ECMA standard, or ES2 and ES3, and you can see the different versions. ES5 and ES6 is the latest version out. And again, think of it like CSS2 and CSS3, or HTML4, HTML5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, right? There's different versions and updates and things deprecated out and things that are used to make it better. So we have a little history here, and you can see now today, you know, JavaScript is the most used language, and it's used all over the place. And honestly, you know, what you need to do as a developer beginner developer, it's very important you get strong skills in the three main areas of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And up to this point, I would say we focus very heavily on CSS because it's easier. It's the kind of the pretty side of things. Now, this is the way I want you to think about this, and I think we talked about it in a previous video, but I want you to think of HTML as the content, the scaffolding, the structure. It's got lots of content in there, right? And images and things like that, but it also provides div tags and things that we're going to be able to use with CSS later. So it's kind of like putting up the scaffolding, but it really doesn't make it pretty yet. I mean, there's some pictures and some things, but really just pretty much it's the content, it's the substance of it, right? Well, CSS comes in and it's the pretty committee. It's going to take all those divs and resize them and put background colors and shift things around and really control the look and feel of what our pages look like. Now, JavaScript, on the other hand, complements both of those in a sense that it adds the interactivity to our pages. Okay, now we have used some interactivity elements inside of CSS, like we can do a hover tag, right? We can use transform tags to kind of flip things upside down or move stuff around or whatever. But with JavaScript, we can start adding some interactivity. So in this example here, I just click a button and you can see this little alert box comes up. I can click here and click this button and it gives me like a cancel or OK if I'm going to hit OK to that, right? It might be something as simple as using a mouse over or a mouse out to hover over top of an item and then run a function to change its size. So we're adding this interactivity where we can have these events take place where we do something and then something's going to happen. And the sky's the limit with JavaScript as far as what we can do. CSS is definitely super fast, and if you can do a lot of this stuff in CSS, great, and it's awesome. But you can do so much more with JavaScript, and it's important to start thinking that way of using that interactivity to add a lot into our websites. And then if you want to add a fourth element to focus on, that's really your back-end languages like we cover, like PHP or ASP or some of these other things. And those you want to think of it as not your content, not your pretty committee, not your interactivity, but your processing. This is where you're going to process an email and send it out. This is where you're going to take a bunch of data and compare a username and password or store something in a database. That's really where these backend languages kind of come into play. So, it's easy to kind of think about those four that way and compare and contrast them a little bit more. But JavaScript, again, adds that interactivity layer into our web pages.